I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and this is the new Hyundai Ioniq 5 electric vehicle, and it will be here in Australia within months. And in today's video, I'm going to take you through everything you need to know about the new Ioniq 5. The Ioniq 5 is a new mid-size SUV from Hyundai that's the first product to be launched on the brand's new E-GMP modular electric vehicle platform. So unlike something like the Kona Electric, the Ioniq 5 is built from the ground up to be an EV. In today's video, we're going to see all the ways that that manifests itself. Mainly, it's the packaging inside. It's so roomy, despite only being as long as a Tucson. However, it is as wide as a Santa Fe, and the wheelbase is longer than that of Hyundai's largest SUV, the Palisade. However, being an EV from the ground up also gives you heaps of efficiencies in terms of the powertrains that are on offer and the battery sizes in this vehicle. In fact, it has the largest battery of any Hyundai EV so far. We'll run through all of the stats for the powertrains that are coming to Australia and those that will be available globally later in the video. We'll also take a look inside this mid-sized SUV that is fully electric powered. We'll have a look in the frunk and in the boot, and we'll chat about what we can expect when this vehicle hits the Australian market. But if you haven't already done so, please hit subscribe down below the video. But first, let's get all the basics out of the way on the new Hyundai Ioniq 5. What's it going to cost? How far will you be able to drive it? And which models will be offered here in Australia? Well, in terms of price, we've been given an indication from Hyundai Australia that it's going to come in way under where Tesla will pitch the Model Y, and we're expecting that car to cost in the vicinity of $70,000 to $80,000. So I think it's safe to say that you'll be able to get an Ioniq 5 for around $60,000 to $65,000 here in Australia. Now, in terms of range and powertrains, the only WLTP range that's been given for this car so far is 470 to 480 kilometers, and that applies to the permutation of the Ioniq 5 that uses the rear-wheel drive powertrain and the extended battery. There'll effectively be four drivetrains offered on this car. There's the rear-wheel drive and the all-wheel drive, and then globally those could be paired to either the standard battery or the extended battery. The standard battery has 58 kilowatt hours of capacity, whereas the optional extended battery has 72.6 kilowatt hours of capacity. Now, Hyundai Australia says that they're going to bring a combination of those powertrains to Australia. They haven't committed to bringing all four, but it's very likely that there will be a more affordable rear-wheel drive version and then a higher spec all-wheel drive, and that a mix of standard and extended batteries will be offered somewhere throughout that range. Now, obviously an all-wheel drive with the standard battery would have the shortest range of any Ioniq 5, whereas the rear drive with extended battery has that longest range, which has already been quoted as 470, 480 kilometers. So this isn't an especially long range EV, but the E-GMP platform that sits underneath the Ioniq 5 is fully modular, so it can be lengthened, additional batteries can be put in, so it's highly likely that in future we'll see an Ioniq vehicle with a much longer range than this Ioniq 5. But as for most people here in Australia, a range of 480 kilometers certainly isn't bad, and we'll be testing that in the real world just as soon as we're able to get behind the wheel of this new Hyundai. In terms of power and torque, again, there are four different numbers that apply to the various powertrain combinations in this car. The lowest power is the rear-wheel drive standard battery. That has 125 kilowatts of power and 350 newton meters of torque. Optioning the extended battery on the rear-wheel drive version ups the power to 160 kilowatts, keeps torque steady. Then opting for the dual motor all-wheel drive version of the Ioniq 5 sees power up to 173 kilowatts on the standard battery and a whopping 605 newton meters of torque, whereas the cream of the crop will be the all-wheel drive extended battery with 225 kilowatts of power and 605 newton meters of torque. This vehicle will become the first on the Australian market to offer 350 kilowatt DC charging, and it's also standard no matter which of the Ioniq 5 variants you buy. Now that's seriously quick. With the 58 kilowatt hour standard battery that will be the entry-level version of this car, you'll be able to go from 10 to 80% of range in just 18 minutes, and a 5-minute charge will get 100 kilometers of range into this vehicle. So while it's still not quite as flexible as petrol or diesel in terms of speed of refueling, it's certainly getting a lot closer, and that's a pretty great feature to have as standard on a vehicle that Hyundai says is going to be cheaper than a Tesla Model Y here in Australia. The design of the Ioniq 5 is intended to evoke the legacy of the Hyundai Pony, which is a pretty groundbreaking small car for this brand back in 1975. Now, the Pony was designed by Giorgetto Giugiaro, who also went on to design the Lancia Delta Integrale. Now, I've seen a few memes of this car put up next to the Delta, in particular Delta wheels chucked onto the Ioniq 5, and the resemblance between the two cars makes a lot of sense when you look into how both of them came into being. But I think the Ioniq 5 is probably the most successful transition from concept car to production vehicle that I've ever seen. And partially that is down to the fact it is on an EV specific platform. So there's no having to design around a combustion engine up front. Now we still do have a bonnet covering the frunk on this car, but it's pretty short. The whole design is fairly cab forward, but not in a kind of ugly, overly rounded way like we see on some EVs. The front end though is really special. We have this parametric pixel design, which is an evolution of parametric design that we've seen on the i30 sedan and other slightly more controversial Hyundais of late. So the headlights, I mean, they just look so cool to me. The daytime running lights are actually incorporated into this silver bar. They disappear entirely when they're switched off. We've also got a bit of active aero down here for additional cooling. And then really cool touches like these 20-inch wheels. Now, these 20s will be standard on the high-spec version of the car, which is likely to be known as the Ioniq 5 Highlander here in Australia. They'll also be shod in new Michelin Pilot Sport EV tyres that aim to combine a little bit of range efficiency with higher grip levels than traditional electric vehicle tyres that tend to be a little bit scary in the wet. Now, the 20s look pretty cool. We've also got this camera shutter design in the silver cladding, and silver cladding will be standard here in Australia. Even though black plastic cladding will be offered in some other markets, that won't be an option or a low spec fitment here in Australia. And the cool design touches actually continue around the back as well. While there is some spirit of the Hyundai Pony in the Ioniq 5, the other big controlling influence here was the look of 1980s electronics. And I personally think that is absolutely awesome that they've stayed really true to the concept behind this vehicle. And you can see that is also reflected in the taillights here, where we've got these very overt square LEDs. Now, in some markets, there is a lower spec lighting package that actually moves some of the elements down here into the bumper. That won't be coming to Australia. The best LED lighting package will be standard on Australian delivered Ioniq 5s, and I think that is a good move. So we've got the brake lights and the indicators here, and then actually the reversing lights are inset further into this bar, and then you can see this really delicate full-length LED light bar. And if anybody was to suggest that Hyundai as a group are not moving their design rapidly upscale, then I think elements like that, which are quite difficult to do actually, would dispute it pretty comprehensively. Now, it's a little bit hard to see with this car, which is painted in galactic grey, but all of this trim down here is actually sort of matte silver. And as I mentioned earlier, that will be standard for Australia as well. Other colours are going to include black. There's been lots of spy photos of a black Ioniq 5, white, there'll be a teal, there'll be a lighter blue. So there will be a bit of a spectrum to choose from on this car. Now, let's have a quick look in the boot as well. A bit of a flash of the indicators as the power tailgate goes up, albeit a little slowly. 531 litres is the VDA capacity in the back of this car. It's a fairly sort of big hole, this boot. There aren't any hooks or anything like that. You do get a net, however, to stow any delicate items. And under the floor, if you have a version with the Bose premium stereo, you get nothing under there, you get a subwoofer. If you go without, there is a bit of extra storage, but on all Ioniq 5s, there's no spare wheel, only a tyre repair kit, and that's the case even if you go for the smaller 19-inch wheels. Now, in addition to that 531 litre boot, and just before we pop inside, there's also a frunk in this car beneath traditional bonnet release, if you like. It looks like some kind of motor, but it's not. This car is dual motor, but it's not exposed here in front. Another little latch here opens up to reveal 24 litres of space in the all-wheel drive version, 55 litres of space in the rear drive. Really, Hyundai is saying this is just somewhere to put an emergency charging cable or any adapters you want to keep with the car. It is sealed, however, for water, and it doesn't get too hot in there, the brand says, so I guess you could put something else in there if you wanted to. But the main cargo space in this car is, of course, in the traditional boot. Perhaps the best feature of the Ioniq 5 you've already seen are these zero gravity seats up front that give you a seriously relaxing position when you're charging the vehicle. And of course, the Ioniq 5's real party trick is that it becomes the first EV on the market in Australia to be capable of charging at 350 kilowatt DC, which means you'll go from 10 to 80% of a battery charge on the standard battery in just 18 minutes. And here in New South Wales, there's already quite a few 350 kilowatt DC charging stations that we'll be taking advantage of when we drive the Ioniq 5 on local roads later this year. But while it does let you get comfortable while charging, the infotainment in the Ioniq 5, while impressive, isn't quite at the same level as a Tesla Model 3. No Netflix or video games in here, for example, but nothing's stopping you from bringing your own iPad. Now, speaking of that infotainment, you get Hyundai's latest generation. That means dual 12.3-inch screens. The central one is a touchscreen. The graphics are quite different for the Ioniq 5. They have a much lighter color theme, although you can choose a dark theme as well if you want to. And then in front of the driver, you also have a screen with dedicated EV graphics that is really totally different to Hyundai's combustion engine vehicles. There's still no putting a full map in front of you, but you do at least get cool animations of how much range you have left, how much of the power you're tapping into, etc. There are lots of other changes to the interior design structure of the Ioniq 5 compared to something like even the new Tucson. The first thing is that all the driving controls have been moved up off this console here and onto the dash, and in particular this new steering wheel. Totally new design for the brand. We have a rather AMG-like drive mode switch. It isn't actually a rotary dial, you press it, but we have a large lever or stalk for the direction of the car. I won't say gears because it is a direction selector. It's kind of like a huge column shift, but it gets it up and out of this space. And that's important because this console can actually slide 140 millimeters, allowing you to scoot out the other side of the car if this is a bit tight and up against a wall, for example. We're also sitting underneath a fixed panoramic roof. Now, it doesn't open, no opening sunroof will be available on the Ioniq 5, but you'll be able to option in this fixed glass panel, which is pretty dramatic and lets plenty of light into the cabin. And globally, there's also an option to add the solar roof that was first seen on the Hyundai Sonata plug-in hybrid. Now, that doesn't really recharge the battery of this vehicle to any major extent. A full charge would actually take around 6 months of sunlight, but it does keep the 12-volt battery of the car topped up, so that doesn't really become a problem. So Hyundai Australia haven't decided whether to bring that feature to Australia. We'll have to wait and see. Now, as you'd expect for a dedicated EV, the materials used in the cabin of the Ioniq 5 do have an eco-conscious spin, if not to quite the same extent as some other EVs we've seen lately. For example, these light grey seats are still real leather, but they're eco-processed leather, so natural dyes are used as opposed to animal or fish dyes in order to get these to the colour that you see here. But globally, there will be a vegan leather option. There'll also be a cloth seat option, similarly eco-processed. Now, there are some recyclable materials used as trim, including recycled paper here in the door. It almost has a marble effect to it. It looks really cool. And material quality generally, oh, that's hard, but generally is pretty soft and plush in the Ioniq 5 and about what you would expect for a vehicle that is slated to cost sort of $60,000, $65,000 when it hits the market here in Australia. But overwhelmingly, the feeling up front is one of space. And that's because the firewall is much closer to the front of the car. That's been pushed right out. The HVAC unit, for example, is half in, half out of the firewall, and that just gets this dashboard right out of your way. It gives you this overwhelming feeling of openness and space in the cabin. And of course, it allows the space for that little trick with the seats to get into zero gravity mode to actually be a thing. So up front, the Ioniq 5 is really presentable. It feels, you know, halfway between a regular car and a concept car, but all in all, I think it works well, and I'm looking forward to trying out all the features on the road. But for now, let's have a look in the second row. Being built on the new E-GMP platform, the Ioniq 5 has a totally flat floor because sitting beneath us is the battery pack. Now in an EV, that can be a blessing and a curse. If you have a sort of low riding sedan EV, like a Tesla Model 3, what you typically get in the back is a relatively high floor and your knees end up kind of around your face. But in the Ioniq 5, because it takes the form of a mid-size SUV, that's less noticeable. So for myself, with my feet flat on the floor, there's only a small gap between like my knee region and the seat base. It's pretty comfortable. I'd be happy to do a couple of hours back here. The other benefit though of having a fully flat floor is that you can actually get somebody in the middle without them complaining too much. There's no issue with foot space. All you really need to do is push that center console forward, because then you get really great access here across the back. And I think that parents are particularly going to like the Ioniq 5 because it just makes fitting child seats that much more accessible, and you can even potentially crawl across, you know, in front of one easier because you're not having to navigate that huge transmission tunnel or anything in that vein in the floor of the Ioniq 5. Now, in terms of headroom, for myself at 6 foot, I've still got an inch or two despite this car having the optional fixed pano roof. Legroom's really good, and the car actually gets a power seat base, so you can push it all the way back or you can push it forward in order to free up more boot space, and that can be done from a control on the passenger seat too. So if you're sitting in the driver's seat and you quickly need to free up a bit more boot space, really easy to do so without having to get out of the car. We've got manual recline. You can see that we go quite a way back. It's you know, maxo relaxo, this car. So for those 18 minutes you have to spend charging it on a 350 kilowatt charger, you can really recline and take a little power nap. Always a good safety feature. Air vents are fitted in the back. They're here on the B pillars rather than in the center, where you do find 2 more USB ports. Now, no USB-C in the Ioniq 5, which is a bit weird for a car launching in 2021, but there are plenty of old style USB-A ports available. There's also a map pocket on each of the front seats, so pretty full featured here in the second row. So those are my detailed first impressions of the new Hyundai Ioniq 5, an EV that I'm certainly looking forward to driving when it arrives here in Australia later in 2021. And judging on your comments, I know you're keen to see this car on local roads as well. It's very consequential for Hyundai, there's no two ways about it. The first really serious foray into a dedicated EV platform, really fast speed charging, decent range out of this vehicle, good bona fides on paper, and if they can price it under the Tesla Model Y, which is currently the plan, then could be a real winner on their hands here. But I'm keen to know what you think, so let me know down below the video. While you're there, make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell if you haven't already done so. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.